Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, starting with Chapter 11. Heidi gains in one way and loses in another. Every afternoon, while Clara was resting, the grandmother took Heidi into her room. She had a lot of pretty dolls, and she showed Heidi how to make dresses for them. Then grandmother liked to hear Heidi read aloud, and the oftener she read her tales, the fonder she grew of them. Still, Heidi never looked really happy, and her eyes were no longer bright. In the last week of the grandmother's visit, she called Heidi into her room as usual one day after dinner. The child came with her book under her arm. The grandmother called her to come close, and then laying the book aside, said, "Now, child, tell me why you are not happy. Have you still the same trouble at heart?" Heidi nodded in reply. "Have you told God about it?" "Yes." "And do you pray every day that he will make things right, and that you may be happy again?" "No, I have stopped praying." "Do not tell me that, Heidi. Why have you stopped praying?" "It is of no use. God does not listen," Heidi said in a trembling voice. "I can understand that when there are so many people in Frankfurt praying to him every evening, he cannot answer all the prayers. He certainly has not heard what I said to him." "And why are you so sure of that, Heidi?" "Because I have prayed for the same thing every day for a long time, and yet God has not done what I asked." Excuse me. "You are wrong, Heidi. You must not think of him like that. God is a good father to us all, and he knows better than we do what is good for us. If we ask him for something that is not good for us, he does not give it, but he does give something better still, if only we will continue to pray earnestly and do not run away and lose our trust in him. God did not think what you have been praying for was good for you just now, but be sure he heard you, for he can hear and see everyone at the same time, because he is God and not a human being like you and me. And because he thought it was better for you not to have at once what you wanted, he said to himself, 'Yes, Heidi shall have what she asks for, but not until the right time comes, so that she may be quite happy. If I do what she wants now, and then one day she sees that it would have been better for her not to have had her own way, she will cry and say, if only God had not given me what I asked for. It is not so good as I expected.' And while God is watching over you and looking to see if you will trust him and go on praying to him every day and turn to him for everything you want, you run away and stop saying your prayers and forget all about him. You would not like to grieve God, would you, Heidi, when he wants only to be kind to you? So will you not go and ask him to forgive you and continue to pray and to trust him? You may be sure that he will make everything right and happy for you, and then you will be glad and light-hearted again." Heidi had perfect confidence in the grandmother, and every word she said sank into her heart. "I will go at once and ask God to forgive me, and I will never forget him again," she replied repentantly. "That is right, dear child." Anxious to cheer her, the grandmother added, "Don't be unhappy, for he will do everything you wish in good time." Heidi ran away and prayed that she might always remember God and that he would go on thinking about her. The day came for grandmother's departure, a sad day for Clara and Heidi, but the grandmother was determined to make it as much like a holiday as possible and not to let them mope, and she kept them so lively and amused that they had no time to think about their sorrow at her going until she really drove away. Then the house seemed so silent and empty that Heidi and Clara did not know what to do with themselves and sat during the remainder of the day like two lost children. The next day, when the hour came for the children to be together, Heidi walked in with her book and proposed that she should go on reading aloud every afternoon to Clara. Clara agreed, so Heidi began with her usual enthusiasm. But the reading did not last long, for Heidi had hardly begun a tale about a dying grandmother before she cried out, "Oh, then grandmother is dead!" and burst into tears. Everything she read was so real to her that she quite thought it was the grandmother at home who had died, and she kept on exclaiming as her sobs increased, "She is dead, and I shall never see her again, and she never had one of the white rolls." Clara did all she could to explain to Heidi that the story was about quite a different grandmother. Even when at last she had been able to convince Heidi of this, the little girl continued to weep inconsolably, for now she had awakened to the thought that perhaps the grandmother, and even the grandfather also, might die while she was so far away. She thought if she did not go home for a long time, she would find everything there all silent and dead. She would be all alone and would never be able to see the dear ones she loved any more. Miss Rottenmeier had meanwhile come into the room, and as Clara explained to her what had happened, and Clara explained to her what had happened. As Heidi continued her weeping, the lady, who was evidently getting impatient with her, went up to her and said with decision, "Now, Adelaide, that is enough of all this causeless lamentation. I tell you once for all, if there are any more scenes like this while you are reading, I shall take the book away from you, and shall not let you have it again." Her words had immediate effect on Heidi, who turned pale with fear. The book was her one great treasure. She quickly dried her tears and swallowed her sobs as best as she could, so that no further sound of them should be heard. The threat did its work, for Heidi never cried aloud again whenever she might be reading, but she had often to struggle hard to keep back her tears so that Clara would look at her and say, "What faces you are making, Heidi! I never saw anything like that." But the faces made no noise and did not offend Miss Rottenmeier. Heidi lost all her appetite and looked so pale and thin that Sebastian was quite unhappy when he looked at her, and could not bear to see her refusing all the good dishes he handed her. She hardly ate anything at all, and as soon as she laid her head down at night, the picture of home would rise before her eyes, and she would weep, burying her face in the pillow so that her crying might not be heard. And so many weeks passed away. Heidi's longing for the old, familiar, beautiful things grew daily stronger, so that now only to read a word that recalled them to her brought her to the verge of tears, which she kept back with difficulty. So the autumn and winter passed, and again the sun came shining down on the white walls of the opposite houses. Heidi would think to herself that now the time had come for Peter to go out again with the goats, to where the golden rock roses were glowing in the sunlight, and all the rocks around turned to fire at sunset. She would go and sit in a corner of her lonely room and put her hands over her eyes, that she might not see the sun shining on the opposite wall. There she would remain without moving, battling silently with her terrible homesickness until Clara sent for her again. Chapter 12. A Ghost in the House. For some days past, Miss Rottenmeier had gone about rather silently, as if lost in thought. As twilight fell and she passed from room to room or through the long corridors, she looked cautiously behind her as if she thought someone was coming up silently behind her. If she visited the upper floor where the grand guest chambers were, or had to go down into the large mysterious council chamber where every footstep echoed, she regularly called Tinette to accompany her, in case, as she said, there might be something to carry up or down. Tinette, on her side, did exactly the same. If she had business upstairs or down, she called Sebastian to accompany her. More curious still, Sebastian also, if sent into one of the more distant rooms, always called John the coachman to go with him. John readily obeyed, for he did not know how soon he might want to ask Sebastian to do the same service for him. And while these things were going on upstairs, the cook, who had been in the house for years, would shake her head over her pots and kettles and sigh, "That ever I should live to know such a thing." For something very strange and mysterious was going on in Mr. Sesaman's house. Every morning when the servants went downstairs, they found the front door wide open. The first morning they thought the house must have been robbed, but nothing was missing. The door was doubly locked at night, and for further security the wooden bar was fastened across it, but all this did no good. At last, Sebastian and John plucked up courage and agreed to sit up one night to watch. At first they talked, but soon they grew drowsy, and at last fell asleep. When 1 o'clock struck, they roused themselves, and with a great show of courage went out into the hall. Just as they did so, a sudden gust of air blew through the open front door and put out the light which John held in his hand. He started back, almost overturning Sebastian. Without speaking, he clutched the surprised Sebastian and pulled him back into the room. Shutting the door quickly, he turned the key as far as he could make it go. Then he pulled out his matches and lighted his candle again. Sebastian, in the suddenness of the affair, did not know exactly what had happened, for he had not seen the open door, nor felt the breeze. But now, as he saw the coachman in the light, he gave a cry of alarm, for John was trembling all over and was as white as a ghost. "What's the matter? What did you see outside?" asked Sebastian sympathetically. "The door partly open," gasped John, "and a white figure standing at the top of the steps. There it stood, and then all in a minute it disappeared." Sebastian felt his blood run cold. The two sat down close to one another and did not dare move again until the morning broke and the streets began to be alive again. Then they left the room together, shut the front door, and went upstairs to tell Miss Rottenmeier of their experience. She was quite ready to receive them, for she had not been able to sleep at all in her anxiety to hear their report. As soon as they sat given her As soon as they had given her details of the night's experience, she sat down and wrote to Mr. Sesaman. She could hardly write, she told him, for her fingers were stiff with fear. He must please arrange to come back at once, for dreadful and unaccountable things were taking place at home. Then she entered into particulars of all that had happened. Mr. Sesaman answered that it was quite impossible for him to arrange to leave his business. He told Miss Rottenmeier to write to his mother and ask her to come. He was sure she would soon find a way to deal with the ghost. Miss Rottenmeier was not pleased with the tone of this letter. She did not think the matter was treated seriously enough. She wrote off without delay to Mrs. Sesaman, but got no more satisfactory reply from that quarter. As soon as the housekeeper had received Mrs. Sesaman's letter, she walked straight into the study, and there, in a low, mysterious voice, told the two children everything that had taken place. Clara immediately screamed out that she could not remain another minute alone. Her father must come home, and Miss Rottenmeier must sleep in her room at night, and Heidi, too, must not be left by herself, for the ghost might do something to her. Heidi, however, was unmoved by the story, for she had never heard of ghosts before. As soon as Miss Rottenmeier had succeeded in quieting Clara, she sat down to write another letter to Mr. Sesaman. She told him that these unaccountable things that were going on in the house had so affected his daughter's delicate constitution that the worst consequences might be expected. The letter was successful, and 2 days later Mr. Sesaman reached home. He went up without a moment's delay into his daughter's room. Clara greeted him with a cry of joy. When he saw her so lively and apparently as well as ever, his face cleared. "And how is the ghost getting on?" he asked, turning to Miss Rottenmeier with a twinkle of amusement in his eye. "It is no joke, I assure you," replied that lady. "You will not laugh yourself tomorrow morning, Mr. Sesaman. What is going on in the house points to some terrible thing that has taken place in the past and been concealed." "Well, I know nothing about that," said the master of the house, "but I must beg you not to bring suspicion on my worthy ancestors. And now, will you kindly call Sebastian into the dining room? I wish to speak to him alone." Mr. Sesaman had been quite aware that Sebastian and Miss Rottenmeier were not on the best of terms, and he had his ideas about this scare. "Come here, lad," he said as Sebastian appeared, "and tell me frankly, have you been playing at ghosts to amuse yourself at Miss Rottenmeier's expense?" "No, on my honor, sir. Pray do not think it. I am very uncomfortable about the matter myself," answered Sebastian with unmistakable truthfulness. "Well, if that is so, I will show you and John tomorrow morning how ghosts look in the daylight. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Sebastian, a great strong lad like you to run away from a ghost. But now go and take a message to my old friend the doctor. Give him my kind regards, and ask him if he will come to me tonight at 9 o'clock without fail. Tell him I have come by express from Paris to consult him. It is such a bad case I shall want him to spend the night here. You understand?" "Yes, sir," replied Sebastian. "I will see to the matter as you wish." Mr. Sesaman returned to Clara and begged her to have no more fear, for he would soon find out all about the ghost and put an end to it. Punctually at 9 o'clock the doctor arrived. He was a gray-haired man with a fresh face and bright, kindly eyes. He looked anxious as he walked in, but on catching sight of his patient, burst out laughing and clapped him on the shoulder. "Well," he said, "you look pretty bad for a person that I am to sit up with all night." "Patience, friend," answered Mr. Sesaman. "The one you have to sit up for will look a good deal worse when we have once caught him." "So there is a sick person in the house, and one that has first to be caught?" "Much worse than that, doctor. A ghost in the house. My house is haunted." The doctor laughed aloud. "That's a nice way of showing sympathy, doctor," exclaimed Mr. Sesaman. "It's a pity my friend Rottenmeier cannot hear you. She is firmly convinced that some old member of the family is wandering about the house doing penance for some awful crime he committed." "How did she become acquainted with him?" asked the doctor, still very much amused. Mr. Sesaman told him the story of the open front door. The two took up their quarters for the night in the same room in which Sebastian and John had kept watch. 2 loaded revolvers lay on the table. 2 good-sized lamps had also been lighted, for Mr. Sesaman was determined not to wait for ghosts in any half-light. The door was shut close to prevent the lights shining into the hall outside and frightening away the ghost. The 2 gentlemen sat comfortably back in the armchairs and began talking of all sorts of things. So 12 o'clock struck before they were aware. "The ghost has got scent of us and is keeping away tonight," said the doctor. "Wait a bit. It does not generally appear before 1 o'clock," answered his friend. They started talking again. 1 o'clock struck. There was not a sound about the house nor in the street outside. Suddenly the doctor lifted his finger. "Hush! Sesaman, don't you hear something?" They both listened, and they distinctly heard the bar on the front door softly pushed aside, and then the key turned in the lock, and the door opened. Mr. Sesamon put out his hand for his revolver. "You are not afraid, are you?" said the doctor as he stood up. "It is better to take precautions," whispered Mr. Sesamon, and seizing one of the lights in his other hand, he followed the doctor, who, likewise armed with a light and revolver, went quietly on ahead. They stepped into the hall. The moonlight was shining in through the open door and fell on a white figure standing motionless in the doorway. "Who is there?" thundered the doctor in a voice that echoed through the hall as the two men advanced with lights and weapons toward the figure. It turned and gave a low cry. There in her little white nightgown stood Heidi, staring with wild eyes at the lights and the revolvers, and trembling from head to foot like a leaf in the wind. The two men looked at one another in surprise. "Why, I believe it is your little water carrier, Sesamon," said the doctor. "Child, what does this mean?" said Mr. Sesamon. "What did you want? Why did you come down here?" White with terror, and hardly able to make her voice heard, Heidi answered, "I don't know." But now the doctor stepped forward. "This is a matter for me to see to, Sesamon. Go back to your chair. I must take the child upstairs to her bed." And with that he put down his revolver and, gently taking the child by the hand, led her upstairs. "Don't be frightened," he said as they went up side by side. "It's nothing to be frightened about. It's all right, only just go quietly." When they reached Heidi's room, the doctor put the little girl in bed and covered her up carefully. Sitting down beside her, he waited until she had grown quieter and no longer trembled so violently. Then he took her hand and said in a kind, soothing voice, "There, now you feel better. Tell me where you wanted to go." "I did not want to go anywhere," said Heidi. "I did not know I went downstairs, but all at once I was there." "I see. And have you been dreaming so that you seem to see and hear something very distinctly?" "Yes, I dream every night and always about the same things. I think I am back with grandfather, and I hear the sound in the fir trees outside, and I see the stars shining so brightly, and then I open the doors quickly and run out, and it is all so beautiful. But when I wake, I am still in Frankfurt." And Heidi struggled as she spoke to keep back the sobs which seemed to choke her. "And have you no pain anywhere? No pain in your head or back?" "No, only a feeling as if there were a great stone weighing on me." "As if you had eaten something that would not go down." "No, not like that. Something heavy, as if I wanted to cry hard." "I see. And then do you have a good cry?" "Oh, no, I mustn't. Miss Rottenmeier forbade me to cry." "So you swallow it all down, I suppose. Are you happy here in Frankfurt?" "Yes," was the low answer, but it sounded more like "no." "And where did you live with your grandfather?" "Up on the mountain." "That wasn't very amusing. Rather dull at times, eh?" "No, no, it was beautiful, beautiful." Heidi could go no further. The remembrance of the past, the excitement she had just gone through, the long suppressed weeping, were too much for the child's strength. The tears began to fall fast, and she broke into violent weeping. The doctor stood up. "There, there, go on crying," he said kindly. "It will do you good. Then go to sleep. It will all be all right tomorrow." He left the room and went downstairs to Mr. Sesamon. When he was once more sitting in the armchair opposite his friend, "Sesamon," he said, "let me first tell you that your little charge is a sleepwalker. She is the ghost who has nightly opened the front door and put your household into this fever of alarm. Secondly, the child is consumed with homesickness to such an extent that she is nearly a skeleton already and soon will be quite one. Something must be done at once. For the first trouble, due to her overexcited nerves, there is but one remedy to send her back to her native mountain air. For the second trouble, there is also but one cure, and that is the same. So tomorrow the child must start for home. There you have my prescription." Mr. Sesamon had risen and now paced up and down the room in concern. "What?" he exclaimed. "The child a sleepwalker and ill? Homesick and grown emaciated in my house? All this has taken place in my house, and no one has seen or known anything about it. And you mean, doctor, that the child who came here happy and healthy, I am to send back to her grandfather a miserable little skeleton? I can't do it. You cannot dream of my doing such a thing. Take the child in hand, do with her what you will, and make her whole and sound, and then she shall go home. But you must do something first." "Sesamon," replied the doctor, "consider what you are doing. This illness of the child's is not one to be cured with pills and powders. She has not a tough constitution. But if you send her back at once, she may recover in the mountain air. If not, you would rather she went back ill than not at all?" Mr. Sesamon stood still. The doctor's words were a shock to him. If you put it so, doctor, there is assuredly only one way, and the thing must be seen to at once. They walked up and down for a while, arranging what to do, and then the doctor left. The night had passed, and as the master opened the hall door, the morning light shone into the house. We'll stop there today and start tomorrow with chapter 13. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.